Hi everyone, welcome to Goth Nick and Goth Chick, the podcast where we discuss all things Gothic in media. I'm your host, Nick Vanderward.
I'm co-host Lindsay Wheeler.
Today we'll be discussing Satan and his role in Gothic stories, his relationship to different Gothic devices. This includes the big ones, hauntology, uncanny, abjection, and atmosphere, but also some of the more famous tropes that we haven't discussed yet in this series, like the Faustian bargain and the Promethean quest. So we'll essentially be talking about Satan in a lot of different texts, like Paradise Lost, Goodman Brown, and more modern examples like Rosemary's Baby.
So I guess before delving into Satan as allegory or as metaphor, we could address examples where he's literally a character in...
Yeah, in neo-Gothic novels, Satan tended to be an actual figure. Two examples that leap to mind where Satan, the character, is Matthew Lewis's The Monk and Charlotte Dacre's Zofloya, the Moor. In both stories, you have Satan gradually appearing throughout the story, almost in a Scooby-Doo type instance, where you have a character who seems somewhat suspicious, and as time goes on, they reveal more and more of their true nature until they pull the mask off, but instead of an old man being underneath...
Oh, it was Satan the whole time.
Exactly. And that is basically the ending to Matthew Lewis's The Monk. The story begins with Ambrosio, this up-and-coming rock star of a monk who's so pious and so wonderful that everyone has to attend his talks. Being such a devout member of the clergy, he is approached by a mysterious individual called Rosario, a young man who fawns over him. One night, he is confronted by Rosario, who confesses his affection, but who also tells him that he is not Rosario, but Matilda, a woman in disguise, who's confessing her forbidden love for him. So there's already a sense of masquerade. However, as the story continues, she's bitten by a snake in a garden. So there's some biblical kind of stuff going on, except the Gothic story takes it in a more nefarious direction. Matilda is bitten by a snake, and feeling sorry for her, Ambrosio breaks his vows of celibacy and consummates their forbidden union. At which point Matilda says, "Actually, I'm feeling just fine. The powers of Satan cured my poisonous bite." And at this point, she serves as kind of a genie to make Ambrosio's dark desires come true. He's been exposed to the pleasures of the flesh, which up to this point had been forbidden to him, and he has kind of a liking to it that he wasn't expecting, because he's lived a sheltered life up to this point. And as the story progresses, he realizes that he's been lusting after a member of his audience who's come to see him. I believe it's Antonia, who's a young, beautiful woman. She's so beautiful that she has to wear a veil because it's not decent for her to appear unveiled in public, because all the men will be lusting after her. And that's actually the premise of the story. Ambrosio is not immune to that type of temptation, and he asks Matilda to be given the opportunity to have Antonia as his moonlight dalliance. And she's like, yeah, sure. So she gives him all of these opportunities, none of which work. They always fail for one reason or another. But at the end of the story, Ambrosio has his way with Antonia, and then he blames her for seducing him. The whole story is effectively a tale of Ambrosio's fall from grace. And at the end of the story, there's a riot. The monastery where Ambrosio lives is burned down, and he's taken in by the Spanish Inquisition. They blame him for the practice of witchcraft and affiliating with the devil, and they torture him horribly. Matilda comes to him and says, "The men are coming down the hall, the Inquisitors are coming, they're going to end your life. So come with me, and I will set you free. But, Faustian bargain coming up, you have to give me your soul. Ambrosio, being rather short-sighted and guided by impulse and just a fear for his own life in a very short-sighted way, says, sure, you can have my soul. So, the Inquisitors come, they open the door, Ambrosio is gone, but there is a smell of sulfur in the air, and they remarked, oh, he must have been in a pact with the devil. Witchcraft must have occurred because it smells like sulfur in here. Well, at the very end of the story, Ambrosio is on this mountain with Matilda, and he's like, all right, well, I'm free, and I get to be with you, right? Because Matilda had also promised him that Ambrosio could be with Matilda after they escaped. This is kind of true, except Matilda isn't Matilda. Matilda is Satan in disguise, and the whole story has been the deceiver, Ambrosio, being deceived by another deceiver, in this case, Satan. And Ambrosio's like, wait, take backs, bro. And the devil's like, no, you sold me your soul. Not only that, the men who were coming to your cell were going to set you free. They weren't actually going to execute you. Also, by the way, Antonia, the woman that was imprisoned, that you raped, that ended up dying because you stabbed her, she was your sister. And then after that, Satan kills him in the most horrific way possible. Satan is an actual character, but he doesn't really appear in his true form until the end of the story. Satan's role in the monk is ostensibly to teach people not to be like Ambrosio. There's a moralizing element. Ambrosio is kind of presented to us as someone who's up to no good. Whether or not we agree with his actions is a separate matter, but just we can spectate on his mischief. But at the end of the story, the narrator steps in and says, oh, well, don't do drugs, kids. Or in this case, don't make a pact with the devil, or you'll end up like Ambrosio. Satan's role is a moralizing element, basically.
Yeah, and it didn't really seem to take much of a nudging, really, to kind of set
things in motion.
Yeah.
That's the point of the story, is that Ambrosio is deceived, he's lied to, but the lie is thinly veiled, and it's not enforced. His nature as a man is one that is susceptible to some of these activities. He's easily tempted.
The dominoes were already set up, and the devil just had to give it a little push.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's Ambrosio. And a very similar character, a decade or two later, Charlotte Dacre wrote Zofloya, the Moor, where Victoria is visited by Count Ardolph. Count Ardolph comes to her father's house and seduces the wife of the household, which brings shame and dishonor to the family name to such a degree that Victoria's father dies from shame. But not before telling her, don't be like your mother. At which point, Victoria spends the rest of the story slowly evolving. She is abducted, she's forced to stay at a particular place against her will, sent there by her mother, no less. She escapes, and at that point, she is somewhat sympathetic, but the moment she escapes, she finds herself a husband. This is where things start to go downhill, because the husband has a servant named Zofloya. The tall, powerful Moor, a person of color, who disappears immediately after they meet, only to reappear the next day. The story of his disappearance is that he was attacked, stabbed in the back, and thrown in the river. He recovers miraculously from his injuries, and he's different. He's tall and striking in a way where if he looks upon you, there's a great peal of thunder. From this moment forward, Victoria is hypnotized by him, and he comes forward realizing that she is sort of susceptible to his demonic charms, and says to her, all right, what do you want? A roundabout, oh, hey, how's it going? And then she's like, oh, well, you know, I'm really hard up for my husband's brother. I don't really care about my husband anymore. He's really boring. Can you help me with that? And Zofloya replies, yeah, I can. give him this draught of poison repeatedly, and over time he will appear to die of natural causes. But Victoria is so lusty for her husband's brother that she gives him the poison too quickly, and he withers and dies before her and our eyes. Eventually what ends up happening is she moves in with her late husband's brother and his bride-to-be. I can't remember her name. It doesn't matter. All you have to remember about that particular character is that she's strikingly beautiful. She is the traditional Gothic heroine. She is completely without autonomy, totally passive, and strikingly gorgeous. And Victoria hates that. And what she does is she kidnaps this girl and puts her in a cave to weaken her target's mental reserves. Because remember, the tyrant's ultimate weapons against their victims are psychological in nature. They wear down your mental reserves and then they strike. And in Victoria's case, she has her potential husband's fiancé in a cave and she's slowly poisoning him. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, he refuses her charms anyways. His reserves are so strong that he says, I am not into you at all. He's just immune. He ends up dying. And if I'm not mistaken, it's murder, of course, but I'm trying to remember if he's stabbed or if he's poisoned as well. But regardless, Victoria is responsible for his death. Basically, he's highly susceptible. She makes a move. He denies her. He winds up dead. And she also kills the fiancé in the cave. Victoria becomes a full-on, phallic woman. She takes a dagger and she stabs the fiancé over and over. Not just once, in the chest, and she just kind of falls over. She basically treats her the way that Matthew Lewis treats Ambrosio at the end of The Monk, where the devil doesn't just take his soul. Mm-hmm. The devil completely destroys him piece by piece in front of us. It's sort of a dismembering, body part by body part, until there's nothing left. And the same thing happens with Victoria and the beautiful Gothic heroine, mm-hmm. where she stabs her like Caesar, and then throws her body off a cliff to smash on the rocks below. And all of this is explained in graphic detail. And this graduation from sort of a passive murderer to an active murderer, mm-hmm. and all of the desires behind that, has been the devil's doing. He's not guiding her hand, but he's giving her the poison. Mm. He recognizes, okay, you want this person. You'll do anything to get it. Mm-hmm. Here's some poison. Here's a knife. That's basically all that happens. I mean, he does instruct her how to use the poison, but he's not using his ultimate power to force her hand. Mm-hmm. She's acting of that on her own free will. She's not even coerced. She just has a bad friend. Like all Faustian bargains, Kit Marlowe's Faust, for instance, Mephistopheles does not force Faust to sign the contract any more than Zofloya the Moor forces Victoria to sign the contract or Ambrosio to sign the contract. In the case of Ambrosio, he is lied to a little bit more. He is told that the men are coming to kill him. He is actually lied to. But Victoria is not lied to at all. She's told, okay, here's the poison. This is how you use it. Don't use it too quickly. She uses it too quickly. It's almost like a drug dealer saying, here's this heroin. Don't take too much of it.
Right.
Because there's an addictive quality to Ambrosio's behavior or Victoria's behavior. They can't help themselves. And the devil is just kind of handing them whatever vice it is that leads them down this road of self-destruction. Mm-hmm. When they die, it ends with a moral. Don't do this. And the devil will give it to you if you let him into your heart. Except in these stories, the devil is a manipulator. He's seductive. That's the devil as an actual, literal figure in the story where the devil appeared before him. Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. It's actually the devil.
Or a cameo.
Kind of, I mean, I mean, a cameo isn't really the right word, right?
Right.
Because, like, he was there the whole time.
Yeah.
Think of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. You thought it was so-and-so, but it was ideal. And it may seem kind of silly, and because JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the manga or the show, presents it as a joke. But that's actually how it would happen in these stories.
Yeah.
And reading The Monk or reading Zofloya, on one hand, you're supposed to be taking it kind of seriously, but it's kind of outrageous, to the point that it's easily satirical.
Mm-hmm.
The devil, as an actual character, is a bit more outrageous than some of these other concepts we'll talk about. Like, the devil as a metaphor is harder to make fun of, I think. The point of the devil in some of these early Gothic novels, the ones that we just discussed, The Monk and The Moor, the devil, he's the educational component to why you shouldn't be bad. Mm-hmm. Whereas sometimes the devil is just an allusion to older forms of religion. There's a pagan element. So you have Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. You have these religious characters that are visited by something satanic, except the satanic elements, the sale of one's soul, the sinful elements of the satanic presence, is more about recognizing that you're in the presence of something that isn't Christianity. Satan as other, where, okay, anything that isn't Christianity is bad. That's generally how the religion functions. Right. It doesn't allow for anything outside of itself. There's an abjecting component to Christianity is good. Everything else is bad. Everything else is satanic.
If it's not of God, it's of the devil.
Exactly. Nathaniel Hawthorne would use stories like that to sort of highlight the faults of Puritanism and say, all of the Puritans here are actually devil worshippers. And some of these rituals that are taking place are basically what's happening with Christianity, where if you have a sacrifice going on, that's an allusion to Abraham and his son. The Abrahamic religions all at a certain distant point in their own religious inceptions involve some type of sacrifice. Except more often than not, that is ignored. It's buried. They don't talk about it. It exists as a part of the religious canon, the canonical texts. They don't talk about it, and they project it off onto older pagan religions, which would have normalized that kind of behavior. And in instances of that, where you have ritual sacrifice, the threat that's being visited upon the heroes in some of these stories, the threat isn't always presented as Satan, literally. Dreams in the Witch House, for instance, it's a sacrifice where an infant is being held over a bowl and there's a knife and the infant is being drained of its blood. So it's sort of a blood sacrifice. It's not really used as a stab at Christianity itself. It's treated as other, it's treated as pagan, it's treated as satanic. And satanic doesn't actually have to be the devil visiting in these rituals. It's just recognized as not Christian, so it must be satanic in some shape or form.
So, in that sense, most stories that involve Satan involves abjection, a theme of abjection. There's also, even with satanic protagonists, they're often the scapegoat of...
Yeah, demonic scapegoating as an abject procedure. The verb to abject, to throw off of. Satan, in Paradise Lost, is thrown off of or out of heaven. He is rejected. He is repulsed and sent to somewhere else, chained to the bottom of a burning lake where there is no light. It's darkness visible, so basically a void. Satan is abjected. Satan is other. Satan is often a scapegoat placeholder for a lot of religious groups, where if you're not a member of the church, you're excommunicated, or worse, you're a target of the Inquisition. You are an agent of Satan, not of the church, but of what the church isn't, which Satan is he's the champion example of not being part of the church. He's also the recipient to the church's ire. Except Satan isn't receiving any of this. His agents, or his would-be or proclaimed agents. but the proclamation doesn't occur at the hands of the individual who's receiving the church's punishment. It's the church saying that they belong to Satan's house. Castlevania.
And by Castlevania, you're referring to the animated series, correct? Not the game.
Specifically, I was referring to the miniseries Castlevania on Netflix. The premise of that show is Dracula's bride, Lisa, is burned at the stake because, not being of the church, she is more readily assigned as an agent of Satan. Satan is a brand that's applied to people who are ejected off of the church. They are other. The church throws them off, and then it finds ways to punish them more readily than it might its own subjects. In the case of Lisa in Castlevania, either the show or the video game, which the show is based off of, Lisa is burned at the stake as a witch for practicing witchcraft. Though in her case, it's actually a sort of a nod to Frankenstein, where, given forbidden knowledge, she is able to practice natural philosophy on par with Victor Frankenstein. The difference between her and Victor is that she is able to use it as a force for good. She heals the sick. She treats remedies that, before that point, were given superstitious medicines that didn't actually work. And Dracula's so-called magic, or his science, was able to do things that religion was not. The bishop in Castlevania the show, who begs the question, how can science be physic, woman? So science, in his eyes, isn't what the church preaches and practices or expects of its subjects to do or behave.
And if it's not of the church,
it belongs to Satan. It's an excuse for them to burn her alive.
Mm-hmm.
This has historical components wherein, during the iconoclasm, the church and its ultimate authority was upended. Before the iconoclasm of the Renaissance period, everybody in a position of power belonged to the church. They spoke Latin, and the vulgar mob depended on these individuals for their salvation in the religious sense of the word, but also just what's being passed down from these religious authority figures, but also teachers. Everything that someone knew about the world was passed down from these clergymen, including the ability to go to heaven, so to speak. Martin Luther had a fit when he found out that people had to pay tithes in order to be allowed salvation. So he wrote the 99 Theses and stuck them onto the church doors with a dagger, saying, look, this isn't okay. And he and other thinkers like him spearheaded the Protestants, who protested the idea of Catholicism. What came with that? Gothic literature, wherein the Catholics were demonized, and Satan was used as a critical element to outline the failure of the Catholics according to the Reformation. Post-Reformation, the Catholics were frequently demonized, and Satan, in this instance, had a different purpose than when the Catholics used him themselves. They used him as a brand to attack people who weren't members of the church, and the Protestants, who encouraged the behavior of the Gothics and Gothic media, encouraged the branding of Catholics as demonic, as secretly satanic, in the same way that Nathaniel Hawthorne would have in Goodman Brown. In his case, he was writing about Puritans who were fallen. They were reprobate, but in a very active, aggressive, satanic manner. Despite the disparity in these different historical periods, which are pretty close to each other, in tandem, if you will, Satan is used almost like it's satanic hot potato. For the purposes of abjection, of branding, of labeling someone as other, one tyrant or one tyrannical group is upended and becomes the subject of the powers that be, that say, okay, now it's your turn to be satanic. But there's also another component to Satan and satanic properties. You're not just other, but you can own that. And there is a combative or rebellious component. When Satan in Paradise Lost is abjected from heaven, that story, the epic poem, was actually a critique of the Church of England. So it wasn't just some dislocated story about angels and devils warring in a fantastical sense. It was very much an allegory. In that case, Satan was a rebellious figure who would have represented some of the actual figures of his day that were arguing against the abuses of power that were being committed by the church at the time. Satan, all he has to do is be a rebel presence, a paradoxical presence. If the Empire in Star Wars is all-powerful, why does the rebellion exist? Why do people complain? Why do they fight? In Paradise Lost, if God is perfect, why does Satan exist? God is not all-powerful. He is not all-infallible, if only because Satan exists. The Catholics in these Gothic novels, if they're perfect, if they are who they say they are, then why does Satan exist? But because Satan is often used as a brand, you're not always choosing to be in a paradoxical kind of position. Like, you don't choose to be viewed as Satan all of the time. Sometimes you're just born into a particular set of circumstances. Or in the case of Satan, he was created by God. In the case of Paradise Lost, the Romantics, the British Romantic poets, frequently viewed Satan as a rebellious, anti-hero figure. And in Gothic stories more generally, it's not uncommon to move away from the moralizing component and to try and see things from the monster's point of view. Frankenstein, for instance, when Victor and the creature meet on Mount Blanc in that novel, Victor says, "Demon." Well, for starters, the creature isn't a demon. He's not the demon. He's not the devil. He's not actually Satan, but he is labeled as something comparable to Satan. The creature is abjected as this sort of monstrous thing. And there are sympathetic components to that character. You'll notice in Gothic stories, it's kind of ambiguous. In the case of the creature, there's a potential for us to want to sympathize with him because he's been abused. But he is murderous, and he has committed actual atrocities. So, are we being sympathetic with him, or are we being tempted by him in a very different way than the devil tempted Ambrosio, or Zofloya tempted Victoria? In those cases, it was an active presence. But being in the presence of something rebellious, combative, chaotic, just the symbol of it, can corrupt you by you relating to it. That's the whole point of ejection. When you look upon the devil, it changes the way that you think about the world. Goodman Brown, when faced with this satanic presence in his supposedly pure town, it changes the way that he views his puritanical brothers and sisters. He sees them as false at that point. It's upending. So there's no, clear-cut, safe way to interact with Satan. It's chaotic, and it causes you to evolve and change in a very chaotic way.
And it also segues into the Promethean quest.
Yes. Absolutely.
Prometheus as the bringer of
light
and fire to humanity.
Forbidden knowledge.
The knowledge that Satan grants to Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Yes. Knowledge symbolically takes on different forms. Sometimes it's an apple. Sometimes it's literally just fire. The Promethean quest and the Faustian bargain tend to go hand in hand. What's being offered during a Faustian bargain is someone's soul is generally on the line. So if you want to look at things in terms of religious moralizing, what's in danger? Your immortal soul. Don't sell the devil your soul. That's one particular way to go about it. But just metaphorically, the quest is Promethean because it leads to one's self-destruction through the pursuit of power and knowledge. A temptation as being driven by curiosity. You're told not to reach out for knowledge, but so often in Gothic stories, the characters do investigate. Victoria, Ambrosio, they lead sheltered lives. They're told not to look. It's not always an instance where the devil appears in a flash of blue flame, or the ground opens up and the devil sort of emerges out of it in a very theatrical, apocalyptic fashion. More often than not, the devil exists liminally through the people around you that you recognize and that you call friend, Goodman Brown is probably instructed not to go into the forest and go dancing with the devil. And yet, in his case, the people that are doing it are his fellows, the people that he knows. Perfidiousness is a popular element of Gothic stories. Father Schedoni, in the Italian, he's such a devout, impressive priest. I've never known anyone as holy as him. Oh, he's actually a murderer in that case. He, for all intents and purposes, would be an agent of darkness, an agent of Satan. More often than not, when you're confronted by Satan in these stories, it's through someone that you know and trust who turns out to be false. Or, conversely, they show you the truth of things in a way that presents Satan and the things that are forbidden to us as good, and that the things that are supposedly good and true, the objectors, are actually the monsters. But more often than not, you're left in this really uncomfortable middle territory where you can't cherish one or the other, and you're not really sure what to think. Because even if Satan and his buddies are really cool, and you want to go and hang out with them, you can't do it without being persecuted by those who claim themselves as holy, who are your family and friends. Society will brand you and cast you out the same way that they did Satan. There is a destructive quality. As you change, as your views change and evolve, the Promethean quest is fulfilled. Even if your soul isn't sacrificed literally, think about what a soul is. A soul is a promise made by the church. If you give us money, if you swear to worship God and abolish the devil wherever you see him, your soul will be secure. So the soul is its own kind of contract, its own sort of Faustian bargain. But it doesn't feel Faustian until Satan shows up to show you the corrupt nature of the church. And obviously there are a lot of different ways that this can play out. Just in terms of the Promethean quest, it's not pleasant to learn that the church is worse than you think it is, because the church is your security, it's your home, it's everything that you know. And to find out that you are actually among Satan's lot, the Shadow over Innsmouth, where the character learns that he belongs to the fish people. I'm pretty certain that if a Christian read that story, they might think the fish people belong to Satan and his cohorts.
They are even called the deep ones, denizens of hell.
Yeah, and there is a palimpsestual quality to things where Satan tends to be localized in the caverns of the deep in ways that are associated with myths and stories that have to do with hell and the underworld. If God is the firmament, God is the light, Satan is darkness. Whereas darkness is found at night, but also underground in subterranean areas. And certain myths, chthonic, the word, comes from ancient Greek, meaning of the underworld. Cthulhu, according to Lovecraft, is the only way that humans can articulate the name of this great beast, Cthulhu. And it just happens to coincide with that. It's not really a coincidence. And a lot of myths that Lovecraft borrowed for his stories point into more of a pagan or an older direction. Things that are not of the church, ostensibly.
And things like the goat with many young, or
the goat of 1,000 young.
Yeah, the goat of 1,000 young. That's probably kind of an allusion to Baphomet, or other uses of goats in
the black goat.
Yeah.
Black Phillip, yes. And the witch, wherein they are sort of when we were talking about atmosphere and the notion of a concentric progression towards something smaller leading up to the ultimate evil, where Satan is preceded by elements of some type of bestiary or an army or a sequence of creatures that lead back to him. He is often foreshadowed by a black goat. That's sort of the premise of the witch, Black Phillip. Is he actually Satan? No. Is he actually a herald of the Dark One? Or is he just a black goat on a farmstead? that these Puritans sort of have to wrestle and struggle with as they deal with the tedium of being outcasts. They're thrown out from their own community. They have a black goat. Well, as it turns out, Black Phillip is actually the herald of Satan. Not only that, he is Satan himself, and he transforms at the end of the story to give the girl her every wish. Do you wish to live deliciously? On one hand, this is horrifying. On the other, it's seductive, and it's liberating, and it frees the girl from all of the torments and struggles that she experiences being under the yoke of her own family circle. To be fair, her family at that point has been massacred. Everybody's dead except her. So she doesn't really have a choice. She's an outcast. But she's welcomed into a new family, a family that offers her rewards of untold power, ecstasy, delicious rapture is opened up in a way that would never be offered by the church, by the Puritans. Because what are Puritans known for? Clean living. They're boring. And they're authoritative in how boring and controlling they are. So Satan becomes an element of fun. Animal House, where Donald Sutherland's character, the professor, is lecturing the students on Paradise Lost. You remember from your reading, who is the most interesting character? Satan. What is Milton trying to say? Is Milton talking about good and evil? Or is he saying that being bad is more fun than being good? And there is kind of a policing of the pleasures of the flesh, carnal knowledge that might be policed. All of the things that are explored in Clive Barker's Hellraiser. The Cenobites visit the Earth, and they're summoned by this cube. I can't remember the name of the...
Right. I should know this.
You should. Regardless, this artifact, when opened, essentially Pandora's box. When it is opened, the Cenobites come forth and they offer you promises of knowledge, pain, and pleasure, essentially. They're not lying. And oftentimes, when the devil, even in stories where it's a didactic, sort of moralizing tale of good versus evil, the devil isn't always lying. He's telling you the truth, but you're sort of overwhelmed by your own curiosity, the Promethean myth. Or you're guided by impulse, or a desire to have fun in a destructive way. So either you're curious and you look and it destroys you because you're an outcast of your former society, you learn that your former society is corrupt, and that you want to spend time among the outcasts. That's pretty common. Or your impulses are realized to such a degree that they destroy you in a way that is a bit more like a vice story. Subject to their own vices, these characters are unable to regulate them to the point that they are literally destroyed. Or exposed to our own vices, the shame and some of the other castigating qualities to things socially are such that we literally just die from that. It's a medieval way of processing things, or a Renaissance sort of psychology. Count Ardolph in Zofloya brings so much shame to the father, Victoria's father. He's cuckolded by Ardolph's actions with his unfaithful wife that he just dies. Now, in his case, he's like the pure victim, right? But imagine an instance where you are conned by the devil into doing something, some type of vice activity. Like he makes you gamble, or he makes you have sex with a prostitute. Well, in the case of a monk, this would be bad. Your celibacy would be null and void. And this would have serious, like, far-reaching repercussions. So even if you aren't Father Schedoni from the Italian, who murdered multiple people and lied to become a priest, even if you're not as false as him, you are, in the eyes of the church, false, and you're burdened with something that you have to hide from authority figures, basically. And at the same time, Satan, or the agents of Satan, know this, and you become vulnerable, and they can lever that against you. Because all they have to do is let someone know, oh, hey, by the way, he had an affair with one of the nuns at the convent down the way, or something like that. The characters in these stories are tormented by having fun, because having fun is forbidden.
Well, yeah, and guilt is an incredible tool for making sure that your subjects self-police.
Yeah.
You don't have to keep your eye on them quite as carefully if you've made them paranoid of their own actions.
Yeah, Foucault's idea of panscopia. He made the argument relative to prison systems, where somebody is always watching. Even if nobody is, you are under the impression that you are being watched at all times. You police your own actions relative to a system of power that doesn't actually have to function. It doesn't have to function in the sense of there are actually people watching you behind the cameras. You can be haunted by the ghost of this force that ostensibly, if you misbehave, you will be punished. And characters are unable to escape from that. So even if the prison falls apart and crumbles, what happens to a convict? They feel as though they're going to be thrown in a cell if they misbehave. The same idea can be extended to satanic victims. If someone is branded as satanic, they might not want to misstep again because in the past they were excoriated by the church. They were mistreated by the church. They'll want to try and avoid that. So being marked is something that they have to deal with. But let's say that they outlive that. Well, you're not marked anymore. Is that going to stop people from viewing you a particular way? I was allegedly a devil worshiper, okay, but I was reaccepted back into the church. Sure, but there's always going to be an element of doubt. That's assuming that the church survives. Let's say it doesn't. The Master and Margarita, the Russian novel, where Satan comes to Moscow in the 1930s. So post-Bolshevik revolution, the czars are dead, the communists are in control, the Soviet Union is a nation of atheists. There's no presence for God whatsoever. And yet Satan is able to make a return and sort of exist in a way that is hauntological. A typical fear of Gothic stories is the return of the past, a Gothic past. So often there's an invented quality. And in order for Satan to exist in Russia, he has to assume a new form. So he's not the Satan of old. He's not the Satan of the Catholic Church. He's the Satan existing in a new environment in atheist Russia. Satan existing in atheist Russia makes about as much sense as the Goths inhabiting England. The Goths were never in England, and yet they were mentioned continuously relative to a religious structure. In this particular novel, The Master and Margarita, there's sort of a dark revival where Satan is allowed access into a place where he shouldn't exist. Again, the paradox, right? Mm-hmm. Satan is paradoxical more often than not, and Gothic stories tend to force us to confront that in a way that seems more possible than impossible. When Satan emerges in a lot of stories, it feels like it could happen in some shape or form because he inhabits someone that you know. And in the case of The Master and Margarita, large portions of the story are just him sort of commenting on why he's even there. And he gets up to his usual tricks, and there's a bit of fun being had, but it's the devilish kind of fun, which usually involves a bit of mayhem and chaos. Towards the end of the story, one of his cohorts, Begamo, is a black cat dressed in a suit, a business suit. He and a comrade are sitting in a cafe when the police kick down the door and go in guns blazing. They fire a bullet right at Begamo's head. The moment it strikes his forehead, he turns into smoke and disappears. So there's like a dreamlike or an evanescent quality to satanic characters. They shouldn't exist, but they do. And the moment you confront them, it's either self-destructive in a Promethean kind of way, or it is like a bad dream. And yet, more often than not, you want to re-experience it. Stories like The Master and Margarita it's a canonical work, even if it has non-canonical components. Think of the church as canon, right? If you canonize someone, you make them a saint. You sort of bring them into the religious pantheon. Satan is the opposite of that. Yet it thrives, it exists in a way where it shouldn't. If the church is everything, Satan shouldn't be anything at all. He should just be the absence of the church. But he's his own sort of like life force. And there's a vitality that Satan provides through a lot of these devilish temptations that we've talked about. He's either an opportunity for people to rise up, to rebel, to undermine the authority of the church. He's a way for people to have fun in a Gothic kind of way, which usually means an undermining of one's station In The Witch, for instance, the girl spends most of the story being tormented, and at the end she's able to kind of party, let loose. There's a sense of climbing. Literally, at the end of the movie, she's rising up into the air, and she is sort of flying away from her terrestrial bonds. She's escaping.
Or even in, for example, Rosemary's Baby. By the end of the story, she's pretty much embraced her demonic spawn. Yeah, the true villains of the stories are the people around her.
Yeah, and there is a trammeling component to liberation, wherein if you accept Satan, you are thrown in with his lot. You'll never be allowed back into the arms of Christians who have a tendency to abject. They're not as forgiving and as welcoming as they might make themselves appear. Because aren't those the tenets of Christianity? Forgiveness and acceptance? Not if you belong to Satan. And in Rosemary's case, she does learn how perfidious her surroundings are. It's a prison, ostensibly. And her husband seems like a good man. And yet, at the end of the story, she's stuck where she is, but she has a certain kind of autonomy that liberates her from an unhappy marriage. Even if, to get to that point, she had to be sort of tormented. Like, it's a traumatic procedure for her. Just being pregnant, but also just the psychological shit that's happening to her throughout the movie, where at first she thinks that her neighbors are okay, then she thinks that they're devil worshippers, and then she learns that they actually are, but they don't want to sacrifice her. In fact, they want her to be happy and healthy. But her child is the Antichrist. That little detail, In a certain sense, she's set free, but that knowledge earns her a kind of comfortable prison. Hector, in Castlevania, is imprisoned, but he lives a life of comfort and luxury that would have been denied to him if he were truly free. In that story, he is imprisoned by his wife. He is deceived and lied to and sort of guided by his own impulses. And at the end of the story, you're not entirely sure if he's better off or not, but it's interesting how persuasive pleasure and luxury can be. It's a very hedonistic lifestyle that he is afforded. Post-deception, Rosemary, post-deception, is ostensibly going to be treated like a queen. True freedom, like the freedom to do whatever you want, Victor and Frankenstein has the freedom to police himself to such an extreme degree that he is out in the wilderness, like truly free, outside of civilization. True freedom amounts to having nothing at all. It's better to belong to one institution or the other. The irony is that the institution that preaches acceptance, forgiveness, fellowship, so Christianity, the church, is a lot more hypocritical than Satan. Satan isn't hypocritical at all. He tends to be a lot more honest, to the point that the knowledge that his honesty affords offers you certain rewards that are really nice, but they come at a price, and you have to be willing to leave your old life behind. The problem with leaving your old life behind is that you're leaving your sense of self behind. You're leaving behind your past. That can be really traumatic. Because Rosemary isn't the same person at the end of the story. She's very different. The Witch, Castlevania, Goodman Brown, the Monk, Zofloya, Paradise Lost. These characters are changed in a way that they can't undo. And sometimes that change yields unearthly pleasures, but it also forsakes them in the same way that Satan was forsaken. Adam and Eve, at the end of Paradise Lost, are cast out of paradise. And there's a horror in that realization. Even if there is trouble in paradise, there's still a comfort in that order, even if people turn a blind eye to the actual problematic elements of it. So when you're liberated, it can have consequences psychologically. Either you embrace that at the cost of your sense of self, or you kind of shrivel up and die. They're difficult choices, I guess you might say, but they're often made in the heat of the moment. We experience Satan in Gothic stories in a very vicarious way, because you're not supposed to play with Satan. You're not supposed to play with things of the underworld, things that are undead or monstrous or supernatural.
Or unclean.
Unclean.
Abject.
Abject. And things that feel uncanny. Mm-hmm. There's a sense of perfidiousness, of not being homely, unheimlich, as Freud would say. the closer you get to realizing that your neighbors are actually Satan, the more uncanny they feel until you pull the veil aside and then you realize you're one of their number all along. The uncanny feelings are replaced with a sense of homeliness relative to you being displaced. There's a diaspora where you find yourself in chthonic territory. Let's say in satanic territory. Chthonic, satanic, they're all similar names. Satan is an entity of many names. God has one name. Well, okay, God has many names, but for the purposes of Christian authority being sacrosanct, God has one name. He is absolute. Satan has many names, and he's nebulous. He changes shape. He adapts. That can be quite an experience if you're a human being, because we're used to kind of conforming to a singular identity, and having to upend that and experience something new is often what Gothic stories invite to us through a satanic presence, but it's not always successful or enjoyable in a black and white kind of way. Enjoyable is a kind of funny word. How many stories have you read where you felt like you're enjoying what's going on, but there's a sense of doubt, or a sense that you're up to no good, which might actually make it even more fun? There's exploration of taboo elements, which Satan kind of personifies. He is literally the taboo.
Well, and it's kind of a summary of our enjoyment of horror and terror. It's something that it should be repulsive to us, but we're drawn to it.
Or the confrontation with rapturous self-destruction, and the promise of that in a terrifying sense, or the realization of it in a horrifying sense. Why would anyone want that? But Gothic stories highlight that as an enjoyable thing, even if it ostensibly is not. And part of the reason for that is because it's vicarious. We are not Ambrosio on Bald Mountain, being dismembered by the devil. We are not Victoria, who poisons everyone around her in an attempt to get what she wants. We're not Rosemary. We're not the girl in The Witch.
We're not the completers of the lament configuration.
Lament configuration, yeah. And yet, we identify with them. We identify with their desires. And oftentimes they appear unlike us. These are ordinary people, for all intents and purposes. They represent the demographic to which these stories would have been written. Or they represent our curiosity to explore the other, the abject, the uncanny, which often lives in kind of a hauntological sort of state, a Gothic state, where things are being reinvented and resurrected, so that there can be some place for these entities to exist, including Satan. Satan doesn't just kind of exist. He has to be given a place to sort of embody. In terms of some of these Gothic devices, Satan can be any one of them. That's the thing. He's not concrete. He can be abject. And even if the characters represent us, or they represent our desire to explore, but there are plenty of characters who they know better, ostensibly. If Satan is bad, then you know better, and yet they wind up exploring it anyways.
Faustian bargains. Faust himself.
Yeah, Faust knew everything, and yet he continues to make mistake after mistake. There's plenty of room for Satan, even if Satan himself is dressed up as something else. Cthulhu is not actually Satan, but for all intents and purposes, he is worshipped in the same way. So many cults and covens do black magic in the devil's name. Is it really any different than worshipping a great old one?
And he literally rises from the depths of the ocean, the inky void, a very hellish kind of visual.
He's a man, too. He's a figure of a man, but there's something wrong with him. He's uncanny. He has the head of a squid, a monstrous creature, and the wings of a bat, or the wings of a dragon, something like that. It's very chimeric.
Yes.
Satan is a chimeric figure, and as Paradise Lost continues, Satan transforms. He sheds his human angelic figure and he becomes more and more grotesque until he's kind of a withering mass of tentacles and other things. He can transform in ways that are abject, that sort of defy that canonical rendition of what it means to be an angel. And Cthulhu is basically the devilish upending of an angelic figure. How is the devil often portrayed in media? A dark figure with the wings of a bat, or the wings of a dragon, a creature of the night. It's easy to kind of mistake one for the other, or to kind of leap from one to the other. So in a certain sense, Cthulhu is sort of what we would see as fallen, reprobate, nefandous. You can't mention it. It's so horrible that you just can't fathom it. There is a surety to a lot of characters who insist that they're holy. We know what the devil is, we just don't talk about it, and they're so sure of themselves. What does the devil love to do in those stories? He loves to remind them that they actually don't know what they're talking about. By showing them his true self, he also shows them that they're actually a bit more devilish than they care to admit.
Like the Castlevania series, the demon telling the priest, "Oh, we love you," because of all the people he's pretty much shepherded into sin himself. Mm-hmm. He's made them bloodthirsty. He's made demons of his flock better than any influence could have, really. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. That's the horror for someone who insists that they are holy. So yeah, that's Satan and the Gothic. There's a lot to cover, and it's more of a smattering, but hopefully we covered all the main bases in terms of what we usually talk about in some texts that our listeners might find interesting to explore. We've hit on pretty much most components that we've discussed in our opening 6 episodes, where we looked into the main ingredients, the main
hauntology, abjection, the uncanny, atmosphere, and horror and terror. So we've talked about all of those relative to Satan and Satan's role in Gothic media. So, and in the future we'll try and include Satan a little bit more in some of these as well. But in the meantime, been an interesting one to kind of brainstorm and talk about for you guys. And until next time, thanks for listening.
Bye.